Hello, my name is Mark Meyer. My wife Cindy and I have been leading a class at First Congregational Church for the last few years entitled Imaging the Word, an Art Lectionary Approach to Discovering Meaning from the Bible. Late last summer, Pastor Chris Broadway Bauman approached me about doing some art lectionary classes that would complement an anticipated exhibit of artwork on the Stations of the Cross that was being specifically prepared for our sanctuary for Lent by noted Denver artist Trina Buemiller. Bonnie Forbes, Cindy Meyer, myself, and Chris began discussions in earnest about this project at the first of the year. Three things came out of those discussions. First was an artist and meditation brochure, if you will, for the opening of the exhibition and for the FCC congregation for those 14 Buemiller paintings entitled Via Dolorosa. Second was an artist talk by Trina Buemiller that occurred in the chapel on February 9th. And third is this art lectionary class series, Stations of the Cross, A Road to Remember, in 3 parts. This, of course, is the first of the 3-part class series. Our goals for this series are to familiarize you with the Stations of the Cross tradition so that you may have a more meaningful engagement with the Buemiller art in the sanctuary, and to provide you with an experience of the Stations of the Cross during this season that may enhance your personal worship and meditative practice. Now, if you grew up Catholic, you're probably very familiar with the Stations of the Cross tradition. One can go to most Catholic churches today and see the 14 stations exhibited in either the sanctuary or a chapel. The stations trace through art representations, events along the road from Jesus' sentencing by Pilate to his crucifixion at Calvary and then subsequent burial. That path is traditionally called the Via Dolorosa, which is translated the way of suffering. Here are the traditional 14 stations. When you look at this list, you will recognize several of the events from the Bible. But there are some that are extra biblical that are now highlighted in yellow. We're going to talk about these later in the class, but I would note that the one overarching theme about the Stations of the Cross is the falls of Jesus along the road. The pain and the agony of Jesus's experience is not limited to the false condemnation, his flogging, his humiliation from the crowds, and his crucifixion death. It is also felt and highlighted in the Stations of the Cross tradition with Jesus's falls. So if you have been in our sanctuary since the 14 paintings of the Stations of the Cross, Via Dolorosa, went up, you may have wondered, particularly if you're familiar with traditional renderings, where are the falls? Where is the cross, for that matter? Where is all that Catholic stuff? Toward the end of this class, hopefully you will have a peek into the answer. But first, we need to examine some history about the cross and the crucifixion. Although crucifixion had a history that predated ancient Rome, during the centuries surrounding Jesus' time, crucifixion was generally reserved for punishing slaves. The most memorable crucifixion to us, other than Jesus's, was likely that of Spartacus and his large band of slaves in their revolt of 73 to 71 BC. That was memorably played in Hollywood movie by Kirk Douglas. But crucifixion was often extended beyond just slaves to include pirates, political prisoners, and the lower classes. Without question, it was a cruel, painful, public humiliation that was meant to deter others. The condemned was generally required to carry their cross to the place of execution, and being stripped naked and flogged was the practice. It was simply torture. When we consider Jesus' crucifixion, John's gospel describes the beginning very simply, that they took Jesus, therefore, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called Golgotha. Luke's gospel records for us that there was a crowd, and though they followed him, Jesus admonished them to weep for themselves and their children. But let's pause for a moment. How many of you wear or have worn a cross as jewelry, or even have a cross as a piece of artwork in your home? Does this have meaning for you? Yeah, if we were to make a modern day corollary to the U.S. criminal justice system, as far as execution methods, what might you be wearing around your neck? Perhaps a noose, perhaps an electric chair, or a syringe. All of these things would seem a bit repulsive or gothic, if you will, if you were putting that around your neck as some kind of decoration. This causes us to pause and wonder when we think about the cross, an implement of capital punishment. But now we use it somehow differently. And this leads us to think about four major influences, in my opinion, on the development of the Stations of the Cross tradition. The cross became venerated by Christians. Gertrude Schiller, in her tomes on the iconography of Christian art, notes that early Christian theologians' reflections on the cross saw Christ bearing the cross as a warrior bearing the symbol of victory on his shoulder. Let's think about that one more time. Early theologians, reflecting on the cross, saw Jesus bearing the cross as a warrior bearing the symbol of victory on his shoulders. This is a 180 on what the cross would have represented in regards to the humiliation that was usually associated with it. Many of you will recall the tradition regarding Constantine having a vision the night before the deciding battle at Milvian Bridge that occurred in 312 AD, whenever he was fighting his rival Maxentius. Anyway, he was told in his dream to mark the sign of the cross and or carry the sign of the cross into battle, which he famously won. Depending on who you believe, Lactantius or Eusebius, the cross was either the starogram, the Latin cross, the picture on the left here, or the Chi-Rho, what we know as the Christogram on the right. It's interesting to note that the Greek word for crucify was staurou, S-T-A-U-R-O-O, and a cross is, in Greek, stauros. According to the Biblical Archaeological Society, this is likely the earliest image used by Christians to refer to the cross, the one on the left. In any event, what Schiller suggests makes complete sense, because after the victory of Constantine, by tradition, he became a Christian in the next year in 313 AD. In the Edict of Milan, we know that next year that Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire. It's also important to note that by 337 AD, which was just 20 some years afterwards, Constantine banned crucifixion in deference to Christ. There is another development that I believe contributed to the Stations of the Cross tradition that cannot be overlooked, and that is the role of relics. Does anyone recognize this statue in person? This is from St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and is a statue of Constantine's mother, Helena, who in 326 AD, on a trip to Jerusalem, she searched and supposedly found the original cross used at Jesus' crucifixion. Constantine built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on that site, and it allegedly possesses a small true cross relic. The location of the Helena statue in St. Peter's should be noted because it's in a very, very important position. When one enters the narthex of the St. Peter's, you'll first see to your right over here Michelangelo's Pietà. But as you come down the central nave, what dominates your view is the Baldacchino of Bernini, which sits on top of St. Peter's tomb and is right in front of the high altar chair of Peter at the central apse. As we look at the Baldacchino from this angle, one notes in this lower right-hand corner that there it is. That's the statue of Helena. If we come in a little bit closer to examine the iconography of the statue of St. Helena, we see that her left hand is extended. And it's extended seemingly toward the viewer, inviting us to join her. And what is that invitation? It is to join her in taking up your cross, just as she has, holding the cross in her right hand. In other words, she is carrying the cross just as Jesus did. This is a very explicit reference to the Via Dolorosa, right at the center point of the St. Peter's Basilica. During the Middle Ages, many churches across Christendom purportedly came into possession of fragments of the cross, relics. Relics were a very big deal during the Middle Ages. So, do you all remember this capital carving of the three wise men that we looked at back in our Dreams of Advent session last January? That was part of the Romanesque cathedral in Autun, France, which was called the Cathedral of Saint Lazare, or Lazarus. It was so named because it supposedly housed the relics of Lazarus. The bones of Lazarus were in that church. As the tradition of pilgrimage to Rome and to Jerusalem became popular during the Middle Ages, cathedrals along the way housed venerated relics. Having pieces of the cross, though, was among the favorites. So why do you think relics became so important? In our original class discussion, we were quick to observe that relics are tangible, real. They can be touched. It helps bring things to the present. We also observed, even though we at First Congregational Church are not Catholic, we still have very tangible traditions. The cup and the bread, water baptism. Each of these are notable examples. We generally consider humanity as eminent and God as transcendent. Relics serve a huge purpose in making God's outreach tangible. A third significant influence on the development of the Station of the Cross, I believe, was meditative practices that were reaching out of the cloisters and into the world. One of the significant Christian movements during the Middle Ages was that of St. Francis of Assisi, who in the late 12th and early 13th century, during the middle of the Crusades, set out seriously to imitate the life of Christ. Out of this tradition, an influential text known as the Meditationes Vitae Christi was written that became perhaps the single most influential devotional text in Western Europe in the latter Middle Ages. The work deeply considered the participants in the Passion, particularly Jesus' mother, Mary. It tried to bring the believer into a personal, visual confrontation with Christ's way to the cross. The text, wrongly attributed to St. Bonaventure, was widely read and translated during the 14th and 15th centuries. Recent scholarship suggested it was written by a nun of the Order of the Poor Clares, and it was written in the vernacular of Italian. I'm going to read a English translation from Sarah McNamara's recent scholarly work on the Meditations on the Life of Christ. And what I want you to listen for is the emotions that are present and the effect that they would have on a reader or listener. And this is a consideration of Jesus's walk, an excerpt. And this is actually would be Jesus' mother's encounter. Now, because of the large crowd surrounding Lord Jesus, his mother, full of sorrow, could not see her most sweet son. So she set out to meet him by another route. And when she saw him, she could hardly recognize him. And as they beheld each other, she was filled with sorrow. Then she said to Magdalene, "O Magdalene, which one is my son?" And she, with great lamentation, replied, "He is the one in the middle, who has the cross on his shoulder, and the crown of thorns on his head, and the cord around his neck, with his face covered with blood and with spit. That one is your son, my lady." Now our Lord, moving further along and seeing his mother and the other women of Jesus weeping, stopped and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are those who are sterile and who have not given birth, and the breasts that have not given milk.' Or when you will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.'" And he foretold to them the destruction of Jerusalem. Now imagine the sorrow that the mother of Lord Jesus must have felt seeing him so afflicted. And then behold your Lord, how disfigured he is, and how he goes gasping under the cross, so completely afflicted by its great weight. And he was weakened so much, both by the great quantity of blood that had flowed from him and by the cross, which was so very large, and also by the sorrow that he felt for his most sweet mother, and also for the beloved disciples, who had fled because they were so afraid and full of bitter sorrow. And he became so depleted that he nearly fell to the ground many times out of weakness and exhaustion. The reason I read this is because I want you to have a feeling or an understanding of how writings like this became very much a part of the meditative practice of individuals. And you can see that it is very, very emotional. A fourth impact on the development of the Station of the Cross had to do with the pilgrimages to Jerusalem and Rome, where people would compare their own parish features with those of Jerusalem. The pilgrimages in the 14th and 15th century began referencing a way of the cross. These comparisons involve church buildings, cemeteries, and topography. Here are illustrations of Jerusalem on the left and Nuremberg on the right in 1493 from the Nuremberg Chronicle of Hartmann Schedel, where Schedel documents the histories of several important Western cities. One can certainly see certain perceived similarities. An artist extended these perceived similarities into creating art for their home cities to remind persons of the path of Jesus from Pilate's house to Calvary, attempting to simulate the passionate experience of a pilgrim walking the sacred path in Jerusalem. We might think of what they were doing as virtual reality today. These Stations of the Cross experiences developed across Europe. They were outdoors, along roadways leading toward the cemetery. In other words, the pilgrimage of a believer visiting in Jerusalem was being intentionally duplicated. The earliest of these Stations of the Cross dated from the 15th century and continue on to the latest to the 19th century. The roads or pathways used for funeral processions often became the avenues where devotional sculptures of Jesus falling down were placed. These images prompted a Christian to emotionally experience the Via Dolorosa as they were mourning the loss of a community member. The stations brought the then of Jesus' sorrow to the now of a parishioner's sorrow. The early stations often involved 7, although some could number as many as 40. In 1686, Pope Innocent XI granted the Franciscans the right to have the Stations of the Cross inside the churches, and that is what then set the number of stations at 14. We are now going to examine one of the most famous of the early station installations, that of the sculptor Adam Kraft from Nuremberg, Germany, not to be confused with the Master of Naumburg, whose art we examined last year. Although I think there is the possibility of Kraft being influenced by the Naumburg art. His original stations were 7 stone panels created between 1505 to 1508. They were erected outside the walls of the city of Naumburg. And this is a picture of the city. You can see the edge of the wall here, and right out here is the cemetery. The churches would have been inside the walls. The traditional path of funeral processions came from inside the city and then went out to the cemetery. And this is where the original Stations of the Cross would have been installed. They weren't in the churches. They were along the roadways to the funerals. When we look at these pictures from the same time, in the upper left, this would have been, you can see the funeral procession of people outside the church at Nuremberg, lining up. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you see them walking along the roads outside the walls. The stations are along the side. There's one. If you look way down here, the There's actually stations here and here, and they go all the way along until one gets to the cemetery. The last picture is at the cemetery, where you can see the people lined up outside. Here is actually 3 crosses, that statuary there on the left. If one takes the path today that those parishioners would take during the funerals, one would note that the city has greatly expanded. And once one exits the walls of the city, you're no longer out in the country. The original craft stations were actually replaced recently by exact replicas by the Nuremberg City Council. And we're going to look at how they look in place today. The procession officially starts at what came to be called the House of Pilate. It's right next door to Albrecht Dürer's house. So here is the House of Pilate, and here is Albrecht Dürer, the famous painter's house. If we continue on the path, we've now exited out the city walls, and you can see that here along these apartments, here is one of the stations that's now built into the wall of the apartment complex. As we move further along, we see another station. This one is a standalone. Continue a little bit further. Here's another one outside of a business and some residential areas near a bus station. Here's another one. You can see on the left that a trolley runs along down here. There's a car parked back here with the station and a freestanding sculpture to the right. And back to our left back here, this is actually the entrance to the St. John Cemetery. We're going to take a close-up look at those stations, but first we need to examine what craft depicted compared to what has become the traditional 14 stations. You can see here that the first craft station is where Jesus meets his mother. Then we have Simon helping him. We have Jesus meeting the women of Jerusalem. We have the wiping of Jesus' face by Veronica. Jesus being beaten by the Jews. Jesus collapses, and Jesus then laid in the tomb. But as we look at these stations, what you're going to observe is that in almost every one of them, Jesus is falling in each of the depictions. So whenever we see things expanded to the 14 stations, the falling is actually depicted in craft stations practically every time. And then in the expansion to the 14, we see them explicitly noted as number 3, and then number 7, and number 9. Here is the first of craft stations. You see Mary on the left as she is swooning. Jesus is falling under the weight of the cross. The man is with a club appearing to almost beat Jesus. In the second station of craft, again we have Jesus buckling underneath the weight, but now being helped by Simon on the right-hand side. Craft's third station is Jesus meeting the women of Jerusalem. You see the women to the right of him as he also is again falling under the weight of the cross, being dragged along. It's interesting to note the women here, their headdresses in particular. This woman has a tight band beneath her chin. This was often this would have been how the women at that time, if they were a widow, would have been clad. Married women wore loose hanging veils. In this depiction, we see Veronica meeting Jesus. Again, he's having a difficult time. He's being helped still by Simon. We haven't talked much about Veronica, but the story of Veronica, which was an extra biblical story, was actually based on a story that developed out of the meditations on Christ that we had read from. Veronica was a woman that tried to wipe the blood and sweat off of Jesus' face to help him along the way. Whenever she did that with her veil, and whenever she removed it, the impression of Jesus' face was left on the veil, kind of like the veil of Turin. You can see that this impression is being depicted by Kraft as Veronica holds that. I'd also note that this woman behind Veronica, who has the braided hair tied up, this was typical of women at that time, 1500, if they were unmarried. The fifth station of Kraft is much more disturbing. This is Jesus beaten by the Jews. This is not biblical. I should note that there are multiple campaigns against the Jews in Europe across the Middle Ages that are very well documented. In Nuremberg, there had been campaigns in the 1470s against the Jews because of perceived usurious lending practices. This actually led to the expulsion of the Jews from Nuremberg in 1498 by decree of Maximilian. So this is just a few short years prior to Kraft's depictions. The sixth of Kraft's 7 stations is of Jesus collapsing. The final station is of Jesus' entombment. And as previously mentioned, at the cemetery of St. John's, there were also 3 sculptured crosses of the crucifixion. The originals of all of Kraft's stations are now in the Germanische National Museum inside what was formerly the Church of the Carthusian Monastery. They are there now because they were deteriorating badly outdoors. All of these were carved out of sandstone and would have been polychrome, in other words, painted. We're going to look at one of the best preserved ones, the collapse of Jesus, that is on the left wall. If we look close up on the soldiers, you can see the amount of detail in the faces. Kraft was an extraordinary sculptor, being able to have tremendous amount of emotion in his sculptured faces. If we look at a close-up of Jesus. You see as somebody is pulling on his head as Jesus is collapsed, and the other soldier trying to drag him up. These are extraordinary sculptures. Wanted to show you a self-sculpture, or self-portrait, if you will, of Adam Kraft. It's at the base of the Sacrament Tabernacle in the St. Lorenz Church in the middle of Nuremberg. I wanted to note this picture for a couple of reasons. One, to give credit to the artist, but two, for you to note the polychrome, which would have been on the original stations. And here a different close-up angle, and you can see the polychrome as far as with the facial tones, and certainly in the beard, in the lips, and the eyes. This statue, of course, has been inside for the last 500 years. To finish today, I want to take us back to our sanctuary with the 14 stations in the Via Dolorosa exhibit of Trina Buemiller. For us to be able to understand this, we need to actually go back and examine the message of our sanctuary. Many of you participated in the lectures that Cindy Meyer gave last year, or 2018, on our sanctuary space and its stained glass. She highlighted the scripture from Isaiah 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." If one sits in our sanctuary space reflectively, the meditative parishioner will see and feel the vertical component of the low to high, inviting us to consider the transcendent. We, affixed to the mundane, are challenged to set aside our materialism to the reality of something greater than ourselves. This is the reason many of us consider the sanctuary a sacred space, not because God built it, but because it invites us to hear God's voice. Metaphorically, we live in the horizontal plane as humans. In Galatians 2, Paul states his connection with God comes because of the eminent human action of Jesus on earth. "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me." The Stations of the Cross, or the Via Dolorosa of Trina Buemiller, is a conduit for consideration of our connection to the transcendent through the suffering of Jesus Christ. In Buemiller's depiction of the Stations of the Cross, she explicitly connects the human element of Jesus and the cross with the metaphor of the tree, the literal implement of Christ's death. In this, the number 5 canvas, she has superimposed the candlelight vigil of the Virginia Tech massacre upon the tree. In Buemiller's winter setting of these trees, you will not find a direct representational image of Jesus falling, or of the women of Jerusalem, of Jesus' mother, or any of the traditional 14 representational stations. What you find, though, is images that remind us of the loneliness and suffering of the metaphor of Isaiah 53 of a root out of dry ground. Her trees connect. They are rooted, if you will, in the wainscoting. The dark trees' trunks connect to the ground, yet part of her trees are white and light, and they connect upward to the windows. There is a glimmer of hope felt in the reflections and the movements of the bare branches, reminding us that through the way of Jesus, we too can connect with the transcendent. The light from the windows above reached down, even as the branches of the trees reach up. And here we have the vertical and the horizontal connecting, the transcendent and the mundane intersecting. It is a cross, a road to remember.